Hi everyone, and welcome to Transitioning from the Streets to Home, Tips for Law Enforcement Officers. My name is Blake Jones, and I really have made this video for law enforcement officers and their families, and also for other therapists that work with police officers, other first responders, really anyone who is interested in how law enforcement officers and others can transition from the street to home. So thank you for joining me. Here's who I am, in case you don't know me. I live in Woodford County, Kentucky. I know some of you will be watching this throughout the nation, so I live in Kentucky with my wife and my two sons. I'm a faculty member at the University of Kentucky in the College of Social Work, and I'm also a therapist at Access Wellness Group in Lexington, Kentucky. I play music. I'm going to talk a little bit later about doing some things other than your profession, and so what I've tried to do as a social worker and therapist to take care of myself is to play music, and I'm a really slow runner, but at least I do try to do that every once in a while. I want to first of all say thank you to those of you who are watching. I know that in our society, on social media, there's a lot of negativity about police officers and law enforcement people. And so I don't know that a lot of times we stop and say thank you for what you do. I want to first do that, though. I want to make sure that you understand how much I appreciate your work, and thank you for doing that and for protecting me, my family, my community, and your community. This is some of my work with law enforcement officers over the years. I have never been a police officer myself. I really don't even have family members who are. So I've tried to educate myself about the police culture, and so I do lots of ride-alongs. The top left there is me speaking with the Kentucky State Police cadets, which I was very honored to do. And so I just have really learned a lot by doing ride-alongs and just hanging out with police officers and trying to understand their job a little bit better. I do have a criminal record that I want to share with you. I got a speeding ticket in 1984. That's the only speeding ticket I've ever gotten, I'm proud to say, and I probably should have gotten a ticket for that mullet that I had back then, but the officer was kind and did not give me one. So here's what I want to cover in this brief presentation. I want to give some statistics, talk a little bit about the health of police officers. I want to talk about something that I call the cop mindset versus the home mindset. I'll get into that in a little bit. I really want to give some practical advice just from my vantage point as a therapist who works with lots of police officers, and some other things that friends who are law enforcement have told me that I'd like to pass along. And then finally, I'd like to provide some resources for you and your family that have to do with your health and your safety. So it always strikes me that police officers, law enforcement, are different. You have a different kind of job. You're really kind of a paramilitary organization. You have the authority to break people's doors in, to arrest people, to shoot people if needed, and so it really feels when officers that I've talked with before, when they put that uniform on, it's a very serious thing, and so this kind of leads to this brotherhood that you have, and I would say sisterhood as well. I work with a number of female police officers as well. And it's one thing that always impresses me about your job is this strength. You know, I love a lot of people. There are not many that I would lay my life down for. Maybe my family, but that's probably about it. And I know that every day that you go to work, that you are committed to laying your life down for the community, but especially for other police officers. And I really that impresses me. I think that's really important. You're also called on to do things that nobody else wants to do in our society, like deal with people that die by suicide or child abuse or things like dead animals in the road. So, I mean, you know, who are you going to call if there's a dead dog in the middle of the road? Well, lots of people call 911. So this kind of leads sometimes to this nobody knows but me attitude among officers. And so again, that can be very isolating. You tend to see things in black and white. So I'm always interested in the language of policing. So the way you talk about the bad guy. And, I know that when you go on a scene, you have to take some action. And it's important to see things in black or white, and so that you're protected and that you can make decisions. I've often said I would be a cop for about one day and then I'd be fired because, one, I'm too emotional, and also in therapy we talk a lot about the middle ground, the gray part, maybe this, maybe that. And so I think out on the street, this kind of black and white can be helpful. It's often unhelpful at home, though, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So let me start with the good things. Most officers that I've worked with and most that I've talked with are emotionally healthy people. They enjoy their jobs, they want to retire from their jobs, and I think law enforcement agencies, thankfully, are becoming more and more aware of the cumulative effects of trauma in their officers' lives. There's more and more employee assistance programs, and just certainly post intervention kinds of teams going out, and lots of preventative work going on, which is really, really good. There are some not so good things, though, among law enforcement. There are higher rates of suicide among police officers, which is not really talked about very much. Alcohol addiction is about twice the normal rate, and there are high rates, certainly, of PTSD, domestic violence. One of the things I see again and again, and I think it's because of shift work, is sleep disturbance, which is really a health problem in our society, but especially among police officers as well. I want to mention suicide here especially. Some colleagues and I at the University of Kentucky are doing a national study about exposure to suicide among police officers, and again, there's a higher rate among police officers than in the normal population. And when an officer dies by suicide, they don't get a parade. They don't get a 5K run in their honor. And it's sad on so many levels, but if there's anything that I can impress on you through this video, I want to impress that if you're having suicidal thoughts, or one of your colleagues is, to deal with that. And I'll give you some resources here at the end. In 2012, 126 police officers died by suicide, and about 67% of them had relationship problems. So again, if you are having problems in your marriage or in your relationship, I hope that you will get some help for that. So what puts officers at risk for suicide? Well, the literature talks about exposure to trauma, working motor vehicle accidents, homicides, near misses where you're put in a very dangerous situation. We talked about higher rates of suicide. That certainly is a risk factor as well. High levels of depression. The literature talks about something called post-traumatic growth. So when someone has an incident that's very traumatic, for example, you work a homicide or a suicide of a young teenager or something like that. Some officers, that sticks with them forever, and some are really affected by that, and they change because of that, and they grow because of that, and that's a really important thing for them to do. They grow as a person, as an officer, but some don't, and it becomes something serious that they need to deal with. Literature also talks about the curse of omnipotence, and that means if I had only been there, so if I had only gotten there 5 minutes earlier or 2 minutes earlier, this person wouldn't have died, or whatever. And so officers that I work with struggle with that sometimes. They feel like they need to never have family problems, they need to always be their best, and that they need to take care of every situation. And of course, we know as humans that is impossible. We'll talk about the cop mindset versus the home mindset. So out on the street, you're taught to take control of the situation. You really have to shut off your emotions to be safe. You have to numb yourself, and you have to be hyper aroused and vigilant. You know, I see videos all the time of simple traffic stops turning into a shootout. And I was riding with an officer one time, and we were just riding along. We had worked a call, kind of a simple call, and a noise complaint or something. And the very next call was a call to a suicide, where a guy had shot himself in his kitchen in front of his family. And so we went from that sort of normal, we'll deal with that, deal with some paperwork, to going 100 miles an hour to try to get to this call. And so that type of being ready, being vigilant and hyper aroused, that's very normal on the street. That's appropriate. At home, however, what we want from our families, or what our families want from us, is to share control. I've been married over 20 years now, and so my wife really likes when I share control with her. That helps our marriage, it helps our family. They want you to connect in an emotional way. They want you to let your guard down. And again, this is normal at home, and the key, I think, is being able to do some of that transition back home. Every once in a while I get somebody in my office that I call super cop. So this person volunteers for extra shifts all the time. He's always working, hangs out with other cops when he gets off of his shift at night. He watches cops when he gets home. He has no other hobbies or interests other than being a police officer. This is a dangerous thing, and something that I see often, because the reason that I typically see that person is because he or she is stressed, they're exhausted, they're hyper-vigilant all the time, they drink too much, they just kind of hang out at home waiting on their next shift to start, and they're just really tired. And they're usually having family problems, marriage problems. And so I want you to be very careful about how much you work, because again, your job is very different. I want to mention stress versus trauma. So stress is always present in police work, and again, this unknown leads to kind of a hypervigilance. One of my friends described it to me as like 1,000 bee stings. So you may see a car accident, and then the next thing you may be cursed out by somebody who's angry with you. These are stressful things, and these can be managed by physical activity, a spiritual connection if you have that. Trauma, on the other hand, and I'm specifically talking about a post-traumatic stress disorder, has to do with things like recurrent memories, flashbacks, avoiding the place where you pulled a dead child out of a car or were shot at or whatever. It's estimated that about 30% of police officers meet the criteria for PTSD. PTSD is a medical condition, and you should receive medical help for it, psychological help and treatment for PTSD. So these are some things to be aware of. Beware of developing this kind of us against them attitude that I talked about earlier. Some officers I've worked with are very cynical and bitter, and they feel like every day they go to work, they're going to war. They're going to war with the public, they're going to war with people who want to hurt them or kill them. Sometimes they're going to war against their agency, against their bosses. So beware of that. Beware of drinking too much or using other kinds of drugs. This is a common thing that I see. You're stressed out, you get off work, you can't sleep, what do? You go out and drink with your friends who are also police officers. That is an unhealthy way to deal with stress, and one that really can get you in trouble in a lot of ways. Withdrawing from family and friends, being isolated. See a lot of officers who try to escape their life through, being on the internet, playing online games. There's a lot of affairs that happen between police officers and nurses, and these are escapes. These are escaping your life. Spending all of your time at work, I mentioned that. Watch out for the inability to sleep. We talked a little bit about that, and also having these dreams and flashbacks. Kevin Gilmartin is a former police officer. He's a psychologist now, and he talks about this thing called the Lethal Triad. And I want you to just kind of think about this. So he's looking at these three things. Isolation, so this person is exhausted after work. They don't go out in any kind of social situations. They play video games all the time. And then this anger toward the unfairness of criminal behavior, or toward their management, towards just the senselessness of the things that happen in our world. And then finally, the projection of blame. So they feel that everybody else is to blame. So they feel overwhelmed. They feel they can't take responsibility for their own emotional reactions. So they blame things certainly like criminals and their bosses and things like that. But they also may blame their 3-year-old kid for throwing a tantrum. And so if you have these three things going on in your life, it's really, really important that you get some help for that. So here are some ways to transition from the street to home. Use some time when you get home to debrief mentally. If you're able, turn off your scanner or your radio. I have a very good friend who figured out early on in his police career that, and he and his wife worked this out, that when he had a bad day or a very bad call or something, when he came home, he needed about 30 minutes to just do nothing. And he would just sit in his chair. He may watch some TV, or he may, check Facebook or something, but he didn't deal with family problems when he got home initially. He didn't go right into, cooking dinner with his wife or homework with his kids. He just needed that time to debrief and to do nothing, to sit quietly. And once he did that, he re-engaged with his family, and that really helped them. I tell every client that I see to exercise, but I think for officers it's really important because your job is very sedentary. You drive around a lot and you don't eat the best. And so exercise is so beneficial in so many ways, so make that a priority in your life. I mentioned this before, but certainly try to find some non-police friends, people that you can kind of turn off the cop mode with a little bit, if you know what I'm saying by that, and just friends that are helpful to you, that you can be someone other than a police officer with. Develop some hobbies and some outside interests. Gilmartin, who I talked about before, talks about something called the Eusta syndrome. So, and I hear this in my practice sometimes. I ask officers, well, what did you used to do? And he might say, well, I used to be a baseball coach, or I used to play in a band, or I used to teach Sunday school or something. And so all of these things have gone away over his career, and so now he's just left with kind of the trauma of being a police officer, the daily trauma. So I really encourage that person to develop hobbies, outside interests, and to keep those going. If you have a spiritual life, use it to make some sense of the senseless things that go on in the world. I frequently ask officers that I work with, have you gone through any trauma lately? And some of the things they tell me are just horrifying to me. become kind of hardened to that, but you know, I don't know how you ever get used to a 3-year-old child being raped, or just the things that you see out on the street. And so I think it's important to have some way to make sense of that very senseless kind of behavior. If you have a spouse or a partner, ask for some buffer time when you get home, like my friend, but re-engage them afterwards. Don't ask for 6 hours of buffer time and just kind of hang out and wait on your next shift. Stay away from nicotine, caffeine, alcohol, and other drugs. Gilmartin talks about emotional survivors. He has a great book called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, and he talks about what emotional survivors do. They practice aggressive time management. They set goals for themselves. He talks about this phenomena of riding the magic chair, just kind of hanging out and wasting time until your shift starts. Be careful about doing that. They take care of their personal relationships. They make them a priority. So if they're married, they make their marriage a priority. If they're not, they make friendships a priority. I talked about physical fitness, exercise, how important that is. They control their financial well-being. You see this in other professions like coal mining, for example. Coal miners tend to make a pretty decent living, those that are left, but they also tend to spend a lot. So, this is stress related. So, I see this with some officers that I work with. They drive up in really, really nice cars. They live in houses that they can't afford. And that's related to stress. They think, I could be killed at any time on my job, so I'm going to have lots of nice things. The problem with that is that they're stressed out trying to pay for all those nice things. Emotional survivors have multiple roles in their lives. They are, again, a father, a coach, a friend, a musician. And when you ask them about that, that's what they say. I want to say a word about seeing a counselor, not just because I am one, but because I sense a resistance sometimes among police officers about seeing a counselor. They see that as being weak. And I want to say very clearly that some of the strongest people I have ever seen in my 20 years of counseling have been police officers. Police officers that have the courage to deal with their stuff. And this is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. And more importantly, it's a sign that you want to be a healthier husband, a healthier person, a healthier police officer, a safer police officer. You're not crazy or dangerous if you see a counselor. We are under strict confidentiality rules, so we can't just tell anybody anything. Even if you come through an employee assistance program, we don't tell the agency a lot of things. Now, if there is some safety issue, like if you are suicidal or wanting to hurt somebody else, then yeah, we have to help you with that, and we have to make sure that you don't do that. But what I see therapy as, it's a protected place where you can be yourself and you can talk through some things. I don't know that police officers have a lot of places in their life where they can do that. I would encourage all of you who are watching this to do a voluntary yearly mental health checkup. So go and see a counselor, somebody who's trained to work with police officers, and just talk with them about what's going on. Just check in with them, just like you would a regular physical, or if you do some sort of a gun class or something like that. Make this also a part of your yearly regimen. Here are some books that may be of interest to you. I mentioned Gilmartin's book about about emotional survival in law enforcement. There's a book about PTSD called Cop Shock, and another one called Death Work, which talks about police trauma and survival out in the street. Here are some web links for you as well. Cops Alive is a really good website that talks about police fatigue and other issues. The Police One app is really good. Badge of Life is a good website as well. There's also this number that you can call at any time, 24/7, that's answered by a law enforcement person, retired or active, who can kind of talk with you if you're in crisis. I don't want to forget your partner either if you're married or in a relationship. This is a good book here, I Love a Cop by Ellen Kirschman. And I also want to encourage you to learn how to communicate what you need with your partner. If you need to talk about something that's happened, if you need some space, encourage that. I mentioned before that a lot of cops think that they shouldn't have family problems, so they're supposed to be problem solvers. And so when they come home and they're teenagers acting out or using drugs or they're having marriage problems or whatever, they feel bad about that. They feel like, I can solve everybody else's problem, but I can't solve my own. That's a myth. Don't buy into it. If you have problems, like we all do, then go see someone who can help you with those. Work on your transitioning skills, the things that I've tried to talk about in this presentation, and take some responsibility for your behavior. A lot of officers that I've worked with, they come home and they blame their wife. They say, my wife nags me all the time or whatever. And I remind them that, your wife didn't choose your profession for you. You chose that. So take some responsibility for your behavior in the marriage. I also think it's really important to say thank you to people who we have a relationship with. Here are some websites that might be helpful to you. I'm recording this in Kentucky, and in Kentucky we have a really great resource called Police Wives of Kentucky, but there's a Police Wives organization in every state, and then there's also Wives Behind the Badge as well. I would just want to say again, thank you for your time, for your service. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope that you'll share it widely and use the resources. If I can be of help to you, this is my contact information. I'm glad to talk with you and help you in any way I can. So take care and be safe and be well. Thanks.